I believe in science, not fairy tales. I live by facts, not faith. Science flies you to the moon. Religion just flies you into buildings. Have you ever heard these kinds of claims? They're not these exactly, but skeptics frequently paint Christians as uneducated, ignorant, and even dangerous because we supposedly reject the tenets of modern science. According to many skeptics, science has undermined the need for God. But this could not be further from the truth. In fact, many fathers of science were in fact Christian believers themselves. And to the contrary of what skeptics believe, science gives us great reasons to believe that there is a God who created the entire universe, including each and every one of us. I like to put it this way. Science complements our understanding the complexity of God's creation. Think about that for a moment. Science complements our understanding of the complexity of God's creation. The more we discover about the natural world, the more we realize that Psalm 19, verses 1 and 2 is true. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the works of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. There is evidence for a designer. From the smallest DNA strand to the vast universe filled with countless galaxies. So let's consider just 3 scientific findings that confirm the existence of a creator. First, cosmology. Big word. But cosmology is the study of big things, the cosmos, the universe. But before we can see how the cosmos points to the existence of God, we first need to understand something called a logical syllogism. Fancy phrase right here. Simply put, if A equals B and A equals C, then what? B equals C. Yeah. This is the basis for a logical syllogism. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. So an example then would be men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Simple, right? If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then he must be mortal. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Right? Men are mortal. That's easy to prove. Socrates is a man. That's also easy to prove. So we can easily conclude that Socrates is mortal. So the same kind of syllogism is used in an argument for the existence of God called the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, fill in the blank. Anyone?
The universe has a cause.
Correct. Therefore, the universe has a cause. If 1 and 2 are true, then 3 must also be true. Simple. But it's also very powerful. And so we shouldn't accept this conclusion as true until we examine the premises, 1 and 2, and make sure that those are true. So let's look at both of those premises of the argument and see if the conclusion logically follows. All right, going to begin with whatever begins to exist has a cause. This statement should be obvious to most people. I wasn't most people. It took me a while to wrap my head around what it's talking about. And so I don't want to skip over this one without first thinking about it together. So let's think. Things don't just come into existence uncaused for no reason. If they do, why don't we observe it happening all the time? Why doesn't a new car magically appear in my driveway? Why doesn't money just appear in my wallet? That one friend of yours with terrible breath, it wasn't always that way. There is a cause, a reason for it being that way. And effects always have causes. That's how the universe works. That's how science is possible. Observations, causes, and effects. It certainly makes sense to believe our first premises. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. So, our second premises, therefore, the universe began to exist. According to modern cosmology, the universe has not been here forever. This is scientists believe in cosmology. Shocker. That the universe has not been here forever. But it came into existence at some time in the past. We won't argue how old the universe is, just that it is not eternal. There are good reasons to think that this is true from both science and philosophy. The first being the Big Bang cosmology. In the early 20th century, scientists discovered that the universe was expanding, that stars, planets, and entire galaxies were moving away from each other in every direction as if they came from an explosion. In fact, if you had the ability to press rewind, you could witness the entire universe collapsing in on itself. You would reach a very first moment in time. Before that, there's literally no space, no time, no matter, and we can't even really use the word before because there was no time before. So from that moment, if you pushed play, you would witness the entire universe exploding into existence as God created the heavens and the earth in what is known as, scientifically, the Big Bang. A second piece of scientific evidence for the universe beginning to exist is the second law of thermodynamics. That's a super long, fun, complicated topic. It gets covered briefly in high school physics, and if you go into engineering, you'll end up taking probably about 2 full classes just on thermodynamics. It's not fun, I'll say that. However, I'm a firm believer that anyone, no matter their age, is capable of grasping this concept. That everything in existence needs something called energy, right? To function. We know this. Cars run off the energy from gas. Humans function off the energy from food. Energy is transferred from one thing to another all day, every day, in everything, even the things that we cannot see. Heat, for example, is a form of energy that travels from something that is hot in temperature to something that is cold in temperature. Well, the second law of thermodynamics essentially states that in the transference of energy from one place to another, some of that energy is lost in what is called entropy. That's another fun word. What we need to know is some of that energy is lost, not destroyed, as the first law of thermodynamics states that no energy can be destroyed. It is not destroyed. It is simply lost from that system, off into, wasted. It trickles off into an unusable form of energy called entropy. In fact, everything in the universe is running out of usable energy. That's very optimistic to think of, but is running out of the fuel that it needs to keep going. Once it does, this universe will be cold and lifeless, known as the heat death of the universe. And to understand this, think of a car with gas still in the tank. You turn on the engine, but you just let the car sit in the driveway. It will run in idle for a long time, but eventually the car will run out of gas. Now, to bring it back to our premise, if the universe did not have a beginning, meaning it would have been here forever, then it would have run out of energy by now. In fact, it would have run out of energy forever ago because it started forever ago, if it has a finite amount of energy. But since the universe still has energy, as we can see by us still breathing, like a car with a gas still in the tank, it must have had a beginning at some point in the past. So we've seen two pieces of scientific evidence that the universe began to exist. If those weren't enough, then there are also good philosophical arguments. Go back a slide. These philosophical arguments were a little bit harder for me to grasp because I'm more math and science minded, but for some of you it might be easier if you're philosophically minded. So let's consider one. Can I get just 5 volunteers? All you have to do is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All you have to do is come stand on these 5 pieces of tape. That tape right there on the floor. Maddie, right over here. Okay. So, as a child, did you ever try to count to infinity? Either you quit eventually or you cheated, right? 998, 999, infinity. Well, that's because infinity isn't an actual number you can count to. It just means that there is no last number. For any of you, for any number you can possibly think of, no matter how big, there is always just one more right after it, just a little bit bigger, and one more just a little bit bigger. There will always be one more after that. That's why it is impossible to count to infinity. Now, the same way you can't count forward to infinity, you cannot count backwards to negative infinity. This is what is known as an infinite regress. You can keep going backwards forever and ever and ever, and never reach that first number if it's going to negative infinity, since no such number exists. Okay, so what does all this crazy infinite talk have to do with the beginning of the universe? Imagine a line of dominoes. Y'all are my dominoes. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to fall over. But imagine, again, don't fall. Imagine you push the first one over, and that knocks down the next one, and the one after that, and the one after that, all the way to the end, right? This is what? A cause and a effect. Effect. It's basic and simple. Now, imagine you, Nathan, you're going to be the end. Imagine you're at the end of an infinitely long line of dominoes. All right, in order to knock down the last domino in the line, you have to knock down the one before that. Before you can knock down that one, you have to knock down the one before that. Before you can knock down that one, you have to knock down the one before that, and so on, and so on. And before you could topple this domino, you have to topple the one before that, and so on, and so on. You could keep going back forever and ever and ever, and you would never reach that first one, since the line is infinite. And if you can't get a first domino, you can't obviously knock it down and begin the chain reaction to topple the last domino. You see where I'm going with this? Now, let each domino, each of you, represent a period of time. Let's say 1 day. So, Nathan, you're going to be today. So before today can happen, yesterday must have happened. Before yesterday, the day before that, and so on, and so on, and so on. The same way you can never topple the final domino in an infinitely long line, if there were an infinite number of days behind us, today never would have happened, because there was no beginning to that progression. Yet, here we are. Therefore, there must have been a first moment of time, an original domino who began and progressed forward. Thus, the problem of infinite regress shows that the universe cannot be past infinite. It could be forward infinite, but it cannot be past infinite. It must have a beginning. The universe began to exist. Y'all go ahead and have a seat. Thank you for being my dominoes. So we have solid scientific and philosophical reasons to believe that the universe came into existence at some finite point in the past. In addition, We also know that whatever begins to exist must have a cause. So, this leads us to our conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This logically follows from the first two premises. But now, let's see what the cause of the universe could be like. Right? If we've just proven that the universe has a cause, what would the cause of the universe be like? Well, whatever caused the universe must be pretty powerful to bring an entire universe into existence. It would have to be pretty smart, too, to be able to manage all the complex things that we observe and even the things that we can't physically perceive. Whatever it is couldn't be made up of any of the stuff that we can think of in our universe, because none of that stuff existed until it was created, until it began, I should say. So time began at the first moment of creation. So that cause, the cause of the universe, would have to be timeless, outside of time. Also, this cause must be personal, because it chose to bring the universe into existence. So here's the remarkable conclusion. This cause is extremely powerful, super smart, immaterial, timeless, and personal. It sounds a lot like our God, doesn't it? Everything that begins to exist needs a cause for its existence, and the best explanation for the beginning of the universe is God. Now, of course, this argument doesn't take us all the way to the God of the Bible. I'm jumping to conclusions, but that's next week's message. But it does rule out atheism as a plausible explanation, since atheism has no sufficient cause for the origin of the universe. And this argument does remarkably match up with Genesis 1:1, which says, "In the beginning, God created." I mean, after all, if there is a beginning to the universe, there must be a beginner. So are you starting to see now how science can complement our ability to understand the complexity that is God's creation? This was all just to point to the cosmological argument for a creator. But now let's look at a second scientific argument for God's existence. That is the fine-tuning argument. Aiden, will you go to the next slide? The fine-tuning argument. I know there's a lot of stuff on this screen. Don't worry. I'm not asking you to write down any of that. So imagine you are hiking through the mountains and you discover an abandoned cabin. As you enter this abandoned cabin, because why not? Curiosity, right? As you enter this abandoned cabin, you notice something unusual. The refrigerator is filled with your favorite foods. The cabin's temperature is set just to your liking. Your favorite song is playing, and all your favorite books are sitting out on the table. What conclusions would you draw? Since random chance could never bring so many factors together, you would probably conclude that the cabin was prepared in advance, with you in mind. I know this is a silly example, but similarly, the laws of nature appear to be prepared with humans in mind. Let me explain. In the 20th century, scientists discovered the existence of multiple physical laws that must be just right for life to exist in this universe. These laws can be written as mathematical equations, and there are certain values in these equations that are fixed, which are known as constants. And that's what you see a long list of right here. That's not even all of them. There's a lot of them. These values are so delicate that if you were to set them off by the tiniest amount, life would not be possible in the universe. This is what is meant by the fine-tuning of the universe. So we'll look at one example, the one on the left, that the G there, that is the gravitational constant between masses and whatnot. Gravity. We're all familiar with gravity. What goes up must come down. If the gravitational constant had been a little weaker, well, stars and planets never would have been formed. And so life would be impossible. If the gravitational constant was just slightly stronger, the entire universe would have collapsed into itself after the Big Bang. And the gravitational constant is just one of many constants that must be perfectly aligned to allow for life to exist in this universe. But why is the universe so finely tuned? Well, there are three possible explanations for fine-tuning, which are necessity, chance, and design. Aiden, you can go to the next slide. See, the first option, physical necessity, again, one of the simpler things, but was a little bit more difficult for me to grasp at first. So let me quote an article from a physicist that helped me understand it, and then I'll explain what he said. So he said, the idea that it was physically impossible for the universe to have been created in any other way than in a manner that would support life is neither logically necessary nor scientifically plausible. So as Barr notes, in the final analysis, one cannot escape from two very basic facts. The laws of nature did not have to be the way they are. And the laws of nature had to be very special in form if life were to be possible. All this to say, did the constants of nature absolutely have to be the way that they are? No. There's no physical necessity that they had to be the way that they are. Theoretically, they could have been different. The constants could have been different, and therefore the laws of nature would have been different. Well, in turn, that would have made complex life impossible. There is no reason to believe that the universe needed to exist to be the way that it is now. There is no reason to believe that life needed to exist. So why does life exist? Is it by chance? Perhaps we got incredibly lucky and the constants just happened to be life permitting by chance. Could we have won the lottery? Well, the odds of us winning that lottery would have been like a sea of trillions and trillions of marbles and randomly reaching in blindfolded and pulling out one red one that stands out. That is how delicately fine-tuned our universe is for life, and also how ridiculously improbable it is to occur by chance. We're going to play a little video to help explain this just a little bit more. Aiden, go ahead to the next slide. One more to play.
The gravitational constant that's in this equation right here that every grade 12 high school student should learn, they take physics. The gravitational constant is finely tuned to at least 1 part in 10 to the 40th power. Some say even greater. I'm going to be real conservative here. 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, okay? What does that mean? That's a 1 followed by 40 zeros. Just to give you a sense of that, how big that number is, actually how small the number is, it's a fraction. The odds of being hit by lightning are about 1 in a million. The odds of winning the lottery in Canada, I'm rounding up here, 1 in 100 million. The odds of being struck by lightning twice are 1 in a trillion. And our number for the gravitational constant is with all the white zeros. Let me try and put this in perspective for you. Imagine we take the entire continent of North America and we cover it in dimes. Covered in dimes. Oh, there we go. All dimes. And then we say that's a lot of dimes. That's a lot of dimes. And then we stack them up to the moon. Okay? And I gave up here. I only did some of it. Say that's a lot of dimes. And then we do that on 1 billion more continents the size of North America. Okay, now say that's a lot of dimes. Okay. and then I paint one of the dimes red, and then I blindfold Mike and say, pick the red one out of all the dimes or you're dead. That's the chances of getting the life-permitting gravitational constant. You guys, you what? That's right. You died in the last illustration. Can you see how actually the chances of you picking the red dime are actually better than getting the gravitational constant 1 part in 10 to the 40th power? If he picked the red dime, no one in this room would say, man, you're really lucky. You'd say, Mike, you peaked. You cheated. You designed the outcome. Okay, maybe that illustration doesn't float your boat. Here's another one. If we took a tape measure and we stretched it across the entire visible universe, okay, that's a big tape measure, across the entire visible universe, and it's in 1-inch increments, and one of the inches at one point, just one, is the life-permitting inch, okay? If you go to the, which way are we going to go? If you increase the gravitational constant, just move it over 1 inch, the universe just collapses on itself. Big crunch. No universe. If you take it the other way, let's make the gravitational constant a little bit weaker. Let's just move 1 inch the other way. Then the universe blows apart and you never get galaxies and stars and planets.
So, if we rule out necessity and chance, then design is our only option left. The universe is fine-tuned for life because a divine intellect designed it that way. God set the natural constants to permit life in this universe. In other words, the fine-tuning of the universe best points to the existence of a fine-tuner, someone who fine-tuned them. So, by the way, it's important to talk about objections because they will come up when you talk to others. But there's another reason, other than the fact that they'll come up, that is probably more important. You don't need to fear the objections. God isn't afraid of anyone's questions, and we don't need to be either. You don't need to be able to win every argument you might have, but you should always treat others like Jesus, like he did by loving them and not fearing them, to speak truth with gentleness and respect. You don't need to be ready for verbal fistfights when it comes to defending your faith. So there are two popular objections to the fine-tuning argument. The first objection is called the anthropic principle. Guys, make sure you're on the right slide. The word anthropic comes from the Greek word anthropos. Lots of fun words tonight. This word relates to human beings. The anthropic principle states that we shouldn't be surprised that we live in a finely tuned universe, since if it weren't fine-tuned, we wouldn't be here to observe it. However, this still does not explain why the universe is fine-tuned for our existence. Imagine a man is set to be executed by a firing squad. He hears the command to fire, and he hears the shots of the guns, but then he realizes he is unhurt. Would he say, well, I shouldn't be surprised that all the bullets missed, because if they didn't, I wouldn't be here to be surprised? No, he would think that either the guns were loaded with blanks or all the marksmen missed on purpose. Either way, he was intentionally kept alive, and there must be an explanation. The same is true for the fine-tuning of the universe. There must be an explanation for why it is fine-tuned. Objection number 2, a more popular one nowadays, is the multiverse theory. Far from being just science fiction, some appeal to the multiverse theory to explain away fine-tuning. On this theory, the The huge number of universes, some say infinite, so the huge number of universes makes the likelihood that at least one would be fine-tuned, right? It would be expected at least one out of infinity is fine-tuned for us. We just happen to be living in that one. Well, two quick responses can be given to this objection. First, the evidence for multiverse is lacking. There's some scientific evidence that is consistent, doesn't prove it, that's just maybe. But at this stage, that's still all just largely speculative. And second, and perhaps more important, a multiverse would not rule out design at all. So let's say that the comic books and movies are right and there really is a multiverse. Well, even if there is a multiverse, it still leaves certain questions unanswered. Where did the multiverse come from? Why is there a multiverse that generates finely tuned universes like the one we're living in? Well, essentially, the multiverse theory just pushes design up a level. Think about it this way. If you wanted to know why a car was designed, would it be sufficient just to point to a factory? No, because a factory might help in the explanation, but we still need an explanation for the design of the factory. The same is true for the multiverse. It doesn't explain design away, it just pushes it up a level. The best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe for life is that there is a God who designed this universe so perfectly with us in mind. Again, the fine-tuning of the universe best points to the existence of a fine-tuner. All of this science helps complement our understanding of the complexity of God's creation. So now let's move from considering the universe as a whole down to the microscopic level of DNA. We can find design even in this small realm, just as we did in the larger structures of the universe. So when Darwin first proposed his theory of evolution, scientists completely underestimated the complexity of life. Every cell of our bodies is like a tiny factory with biological machinery following routines and commands to keep us functioning. Much of the information for programming this biological machinery comes from our DNA. Simply put, DNA is our genetic code, our biological operating system. And the DNA in a single cell contains enough information to fill 8,000 books from a single piece of DNA. That's a lot of information. So here's the bottom line. Whenever we see information and we know that information arose, we always trace it back to a mind. For example, if you saw written in the sand, Zach loves ginger, you wouldn't think it just came from the tides rolling up onto those sands and writing that as it fades back into the water. No. You would know that it was written by a person. In that case, likely me. See, social media posts come from social media users. Books come from authors. Texts come from texters. Articles come from writers. Information comes from someone, a mind. So even the staunchest atheist has to admit that there is no natural explanation for the origin of the information that is in DNA. And yet, we know that information comes from a mind. Isn't the existence of a designer the most reasonable explanation for the exquisite design that we see in DNA? Simply put, the information in DNA points to the existence of an author of life. So these are all just a few powerful arguments for a creator. And believe it or not, there are many more. And science complements our understanding of the complexity of God's creation. Science is not against faith, but when done properly, it confirms faith. And this matters for how we view ourselves as part of God's creation. See, in Psalm 8, 3 and 4, it says, David reflects on the wonder of God's concern for mankind in the light of all creation. It says, when I consider your heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? What are human beings that you care for them in the light of all that you have created? Given the vastness and complexity of the universe, David is in awe that God even cares about mankind. And yet, God does care. David continues Psalm 139, verse 14, as we studied in our last series. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. So what does this all mean? You are not a grand cosmic accident. You are not the result of blind evolutionary processes. God designed the universe with us in mind, and he created you with great care. Your life has value and purpose. The world we inhabit claims that our value comes from appearance, wealth, skills, position, but God has a different standard. Human value comes from the fact that we are made in the image of a perfectly good and all-knowing creator. If you ever feel worthless, just look around you at the mountains and the trees, all the stars in the sky, and remember what King David said, that the God who created all of this still cares deeply for you. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for this time together. Lord, I thank you for being you, Lord, for being timeless and immaterial so that we could be here, Lord, for you created us personally. Not just the universe as a whole, but each of us individually, Lord. You formed us in our mother's womb, and you created each and every one of us down to our atoms, down to our DNA, Lord. Of all the stars in the world, you created us. And I thank you for that. I thank you for sending your Son to die for us, Lord. And I just pray that as we go from here, Lord, we have a better understanding of our faith, Lord, that we will be able to defend it should someone ask why we believe what we believe. It's in your name that I pray. Amen.